Welcome to the Demeere podcast. We talk about martial arts, self-defense, and a whole lot more. And now your host, Demeere.
Hello everybody, welcome to episode 64 of the podcast, and this is the Q&A from listeners maximum effort edition. What does that mean? Well, it means that I am going to do a truckload of Q&A from listeners. How does this start? Well, I like to do Q&As because the whole point of having a blog and doing Patreon and so on is that I can have a better interaction with the people who follow my work, and as a result, be more aware of the things that are on their mind. So it doesn't mean that I wouldn't think of them. The point is that I'm doing my journey when it comes to martial arts, self-defense, training, and living my life, and everybody else is on a different journey. Nobody knows where you are at, just as you don't really know where I'm at on that journey. Which means that what might be a particular focus for me right now, something that really interests me, is something that you did years ago or something you might not even have considered at all. So that's where the interaction comes into play, and for that my blog is really a good place. Same thing with social media, but most of all my patrons, because that was the point, creating a community of people who I can talk directly to and give me more feedback as to things that are on their mind and things that I might be able to help them with. So a while ago, I decided to do a big Q&A, and that was for a different audience. Obviously, there's a lot of overlap, but that is in my private Facebook group. It's not really private, it's public. You can join at any time, and I'll put the link in the show notes. The group is called You Are Not Ares, God of War. So it's just a Facebook group. You have to ask to be admitted, and you have to agree to the rules, which are quite lengthy. But I believe that is why the group has still survived to this day, because we have rules of how you can discuss things and argue if need be, without things devolving into the typical internet keyboard warrior shouting matches you see so often online. None of that for me, and I am the moderator there, and I rule with an iron hand in a diamond fist. So, been told. Anyway, a while ago I asked people, like, okay, give me some questions for a Q&A, and I'll see what I can do. And I got some other questions as well. So I decided to do that, and that's what we're going to do today. A truckload of questions to get through, so let's get started. But before we do, as always, a quick shout out to one of my patrons. This one is to Paul Harper. Paul became a member on Patreon, and I want to thank you, Paul, for supporting my work. It's awesome that so many people, seem to enjoy what I do and be willing to support me. And Paul in particular paid up front for a year on Patreon, which means that you get a discount. This is something that I have been told that I failed to mention sufficiently. So if you sign up for a whole year up front, I think it's 10% off that Patreon gives you. I don't have any say in that. That's Patreon deciding that. But I figured I'd mention it because Paul is one of the people who took up that offer of Patreon and immediately signed up for a whole year, which I think is awesome. So thank you, Paul. And everybody else, you want to join, there's so much there on Patreon. It's kind of hard to describe because this is the 5th year that I'm creating content on Patreon. I think we're closing in on, 600 videos, and that's just the videos, dozens of bonus podcasts, a lot of stuff. Anyway, go to patreon.com/Wim Demeere, my name, or you can go to wimsblog.com/donate and just check it out, what's there if you want to help out. But the main thing that helps the most is spread the word. Just share this podcast with people who you think might find it useful. And obviously, if you want to leave a review, that would be really great as well, because that helps out a lot with getting the word out to folks who don't know about this podcast just yet. So that's the promo stuff. And obviously, before I go on, all the links to anything I mentioned will be at wimsblog.com/64, number 64. Right. First question from Carlos Cruz. Carlos asks, I have a question. What are your thoughts and opinions on self-defense instructors discouraging women to not throw punches in a self-defense situation? Instead, use palm strikes for the simple reason Women can't deliver hard punches because they believe it won't harm a man too much. Good question. A nuanced answer, I think, is applicable here, and that some women can deliver hard punches and will not be able to harm a man much. Other women will be able to do so. Now, as you guys know, I don't like absolutist statements because when it comes to violence, self-defense, and martial arts, there's a whole lot of room for nuance, a lot more than people actually think. That said, I think it is true that on average, men have more strength, upper body mass, and so on, and a bunch of other factors that are in the advantage column when it comes to fighting when compared to the average woman. It has nothing to do with being sexist. That is just biology as it is. And you may not like it, but that's just the facts of life. When it comes to violence, this plays a critical role because strength, mass, and so on, they are huge influencing factors in the outcome. Now, when you look at extremes, this is even more prevalent. When you look at, for instance, a 120-pound woman and a 300-pound man, let's see them trade punches. Let the woman go first. She can punch the guy in the face and then he punches her back. Who would you put all your money on? If you need to bet, who do you think wins that exchange? Even if the woman goes first. I think it would be very unreasonable to think that she will be able to knock the guy out with one punch and that he will not be able to knock her out. Just the sheer mass that he can put into that strike. Even a crappy punch that is not well trained, not well executed, there's a high likelihood that that woman goes down with one strike. So that is the first thing that we have to take a look at. Is if you look at the extremes, the point is obvious that the average man has that men tend to have the advantage in the physical realm. Now, when you go away from the extremes and you go towards the middle of the bell curve, then it becomes a lot more nuanced, and I think that's where we need to be now. Can women punch with fists and cause damage? They sure can. Does it take training? Yes, absolutely. But the exact same thing is true with palm strikes. And that is a point that I think is kind of glossed over when instructors discourage women to use punches, in that, well, it's not like you can, necessarily hit harder with a palm strike than you can with a closed fist. And it's also not true that that is inherently safer than using a fist. That is simply not true. It is one of the biggest myths out there. A lot of people, including myself, have injured their palms, their hands, wrists, what have you, using palm strikes. I have a very nice scar on my wrist where I was doing one of my instructor tests that I did a long time ago. We did hardcore sparring, no protections, going at each other. And I threw really hard palm strikes. A few that landed well. I felt some pain in my wrist, and that was it. Kept going. Ended up with a broken nose too, so I went to the hospital for that. Could you guys take a look at my nose? And oh, by the way, my palm hurts a little bit, my wrist hurts a little bit. Could you maybe take an X-ray? They did. My nose was already put back in place by my teacher, so they said, can't help you with that. That's already put back in place. A little crooked maybe, but not much we can do now. But your palm is busted up. You've got a crack in one of the small bones of your palm called a scaphoid. And so we're going to put you in a cast. Long story short, that took about 5-6 months to heal. And it took surgery. So, and that is me being trained pretty well by that time already. So this whole idea that and just to come back to that point, I've had more than one injury throwing palm strikes, and I'm by far not the only one. One of the classical injuries is, for instance, and this is outside of the realm of martial arts, but it's to illustrate how you can actually end up injuring yourself, which is a typical injury that cyclists get when they fall and they go flying over the handlebars, and they put their palms out to catch their fall. And the angle of the hand in relation to the forearm and the type of impact, the vector that they follow as they land, puts all the stress on that scaphoid bone. And I hope I'm pronouncing that well in English, because I know it in Dutch, but I don't know how it is pronounced in English. That angle creates broken bones in the wrist and so on, just like I had, but it was a different angle, slightly different, and I just hit way too hard on an unyielding target, and that was the result. Surgery and months out of action, and I missed my first international competition because of that. So the point is that it's just too easy to say that, well, just use palm strikes. It's so much better for you than using punches. No, it's not. That's nonsense. That's just an overgeneralization. Now, can a woman deliver punches that are worth practicing and doing? Yes, you just don't punch like a guy. Don't punch like, the typical, two douchebags in the club that end up fighting each other and end up trading punches. Like in the churches, where do they punch? Do they punch? What are they aiming at? Oh, the general direction of the guy's head. Sure. I mean, if you do that as a woman against a guy, that is very unlikely to be successful. How about you practice punching into softer targets like the throat, the neck, and so on, so that you don't go for hard targets that if you strike them with full strength, that your fists are not strong enough to withstand that impact and you end up breaking your bones. Maybe not do that. The idea that you have to fight, using palm strikes over punches is just incorrect in my opinion when it is used as an absolute. Now, can you as a woman throw palm strikes against harder surfaces like some guy's skull and so on? Yes, you can, and that is going to be a better idea than punching it with your fist. But that does not guarantee that you will be more effective if you overly focus on those at the exclusion of fist techniques at softer targets, especially if you aim for vulnerable targets and vital targets. Right, that's it, Carlos. I hope that is a good explanation for you. Got a lot more to do. Again, this is the maximum effort Deadpool edition. So I'm going to answer the next question. And that's from Brian Inwards. Brian said, the old are probably some of the most vulnerable as less physically fit, strong, yet a lot of training ignores their needs. Your ideas on this, please. Well, as I'm getting older, this is relevant to me. I'm 49. I just made an appointment to get a PRP shot in my knee for my arthritis. So I definitely understand that question a little bit more every day. A few things come to mind. One of the biggest things is it's remembering that we all get old. So, well, hopefully. Some of us won't make it, but hopefully we all get old. If you pretend that that's not going to happen, that's really a bad idea. Now, the funny thing is that the guy giving me my PRP shot is a doctor and also martial artist, and we go back decades. We get along great, and we were talking, and he just had a huge injury. Tore up his hamstring, like really tore it off. And he's recovering from that as he was just basically, not really sparring hard. He was warmed up. He was doing well. They were doing some technical stuff, and he pulled a kick to avoid injuring his training partner, and just ripped off a part of his hamstrings. And he jokingly said, I thought I was kind of invulnerable, and apparently I'm not. And I'm like, I'm there right with you. Now the point is, he wasn't pretending that he was still 18. That's not it. It's just that this kind of stuff creeps up on you. You don't expect it, like all of a sudden, something that never hurts, all of a sudden, like, wow, this hurts. Or I just pulled a muscle and I was always able to do this. And all of a sudden, this doesn't work. Good friend of mine was getting shoulder problems, and he's in his 50s, and his doctor said, what do you do? He says, I do this, that, I do handstands. And he said, maybe don't do handstands anymore. My friend's in really great shape. I mean, he's been training for a long time. But, the body gets older and you're not able to do certain things anymore. So the very first priority is accepting that you get older. What follows from that is that you need to prepare for it. You need to change your training to incorporate that idea of that I will not be able to do all this physical stuff as I get older. Now, if you're lucky, you figured that out a long time ago and you started practicing with that in mind from the get-go. Meaning, you train in a way as if you don't have the strength and speed that you have when you're younger. And younger meaning anywhere from in your teens until your 40s and 50s and so on. Contrast that when you're in your 70s and 80s, that's already a big difference. Doesn't mean you can't still be strong and fast at that age. Only that's going to be a lot more difficult. And at the same time, and that's another factor, it will depend if you can stay injury-free. Because as we get older, we tend to accumulate injuries, especially if we train a lot. So, prepare. Be ready for that. Now, what does that mean? Well, in many ways, I think you need to focus on efficiency of movement, staying as strong as you can, staying physically active. But obviously, I once had a student come to class and he was in his late 60s, early 70s, if I'm not mistaken, and he wanted to spar, and I had to hold him back. And I'm like, no, this is not that, you can't do anything. It's just that it would be irresponsible of me to let you spar hard at your age. Because the way the body works is that you take one punch to the head and it might be hospital time for you, or an injury that will cripple you for the rest of your life. You get a punch to the head, you fall down in a bad way, or you slip because somebody sweeps you and you can't catch yourself and you break something. If you break your leg or arm when you're 20, it's very different from when you break it when you're 70. Osteoporosis is a really nasty word, but it applies to all of us. So certain things are not advisable. So if you can remember that from the get-go, like, okay, let's train. And I think that was it Helio Gracie who said that train as if you're an old man, because eventually one day you will be. I think that's right. Doesn't mean you don't use your strength and youth, but it means that you train in a way that expects you to not always have it. So stay in the best possible shape that I can, but while you are still reasonably young and in shape and physically fit, try to learn how to not rely on that. So that's a big part of it. That changes your outlook. Imagine that every time you have to train with somebody, that person is stronger, faster, bigger than you, and can take damage, and you can't take that damage. The other aspect is, I think that you inevitably will focus on getting the most bang for your buck in every technique, which means that you're going to stack the cards in your favor as much as you can, meaning that your techniques need to achieve more than one goal. Instead of just punching the guy or hitting him, you hit him in such a way that he loses balance. And preferably you hit him in such a way that he cannot absorb the punch or the kick or whatever well. And preferably when he loses balance, he falls badly or he falls into something. And the way that he falls sets up, and how you are positioned then, sets up your exit or your follow-up technique, and so on and so on. So you add layers to your techniques, layers that you may not need when you're young, but that will actually accumulate the problems for your attacker once you get older, and give you time to do things, but also make it more difficult for him to actually do damage to you, because he's got so much stuff going wrong for him that it makes it difficult for him to get to you. That is a discussion in and of itself. This would take hours and hours of just exploring that concept. But I think it's worth exploring once you get, as you get older, and as you think about that. So how can I make every technique count for more than just one thing? And then a final thing that I want to mention is that, you might have to seriously consider that just you is not enough, and that carrying and using weapons, improvised or other, is going to be maybe a smart idea. Because we have to face reality. I mean, again, Take your 25, 30-year-old self and put it against your 70, 80-year-old self. Who do you think will win in a fist fight? I think, unless you were really, really bad when you were 25 or 30, the odds are not in the favor of you as an elderly person. So, train accordingly. All right, Brian, that's it. So next one, Jeff Feynman. I'm always looking for a fresh take on the question, is there such thing as enough grappling? That is a great question, Jeff. And I would say, yes, there is such a thing as enough grappling. Just like there's a thing of there is enough striking, there is enough clinching, and this and that. The reason why I say that, so obviously ever since BJJ became a thing and the UFC got really big, there was there's this huge focus on grappling. Now, I was there before the Gracies became, world famous. And there was grappling, there were jiu-jitsu guys and so on in the magazines, bringing out books and, making videos and that stuff was being practiced. I started with judo and jiu-jitsu traditional jiu-jitsu, when I was a teenager. So that was before anybody outside of Brazil knew who the Gracies were. And obviously there was groundwork, there was grappling that was there. It was just done in a very different way with a different focus and so on. Now the Gracies took the jiu-jitsu they learned and refined it and specialized it and went really, really far. And it's awesome. But saying is there such a thing as enough grappling? It would be the exact same thing as when in the, let's say, 80s here in Europe, Muay Thai basically became big. And Muay Thai stylists started beating up karate guys, kickboxing guys, kung fu guys, and so on. Because their format and their training methods and techniques were in many ways superior to what was already out there when it comes to fighting in the ring with gloves on and under specific rules. They're specialized in that. So I wouldn't have said then, there's no such thing as enough Muay Thai. Even as much as I love the art and sport of Muay Thai, it's one aspect of everything there is out there. So when you just simply look at ranges or at fight modalities, however you want to call it, grappling is one of them. Striking is another one. Clinching you could include into grappling, or you could do it separate. Depends. Throwing and takedowns, you could include it in grappling or leave it out of it. We can put weapons in there as well. We can add footwork as a separate entity as well. So it depends on so much. And now I'm just looking at just a purely physical techniques. I'm not even talking about avoidance, de-escalation, and everything else that goes into self-protection. So I don't see it that way. I think, try to be well-rounded and maybe you have a love for grappling and there's nothing wrong with that. But for me, it's more like, why would I exclude everything else? Kind of like John Danaher said that, I think was it Dean Lister or, I'm blanking out on the guy's name. I think it was Dean Lister. Maybe it was somebody else who basically made him rethink his approach to BJJ. Because he didn't have leg locks before that. And I think it was Dean Lister, but I could be mistaking with Gordon Ryan. I'm not sure anymore. It's been too long since I heard that interview. But basically he said that why would you ignore half of the human body? Why do we only focus on the upper body and we don't do anything for the lower body? So let's do leg locks. And then John Danaher took that and made it a complete system. And it's the same thing, the way that I see it is when you look at one thing and exclude everything else, like, okay, there can never be enough of this. That kind of implies that you're thinking, well, there can never be enough of this, but there can sure be enough of that other stuff, which in this case would mean we can never get enough grappling, but we sure can get enough striking. And I disagree with that. It depends, is I think the best answer to that. As much as I love grappling, and I'm at right now, I'm looking for a good BJJ class to enter myself. So nothing against grappling, But just as you won't hear me say there can never be enough sword training, you'll never hear me say there can never be enough grappling. All right, Jeff, I sure hope you weren't kidding with that question, because otherwise I just look really, really foolish with my answer. All right, moving on. Next one, James Tan. If one wants to delve deeply into a specific art, how important is it to have some facility with the language of the country, region that art comes from? As a multilingualist yourself, I'd be interested to hear your take on this. That is an awesome question, James. So for the people who don't know, and I kind of mentioned it before with not being sure about scaphoid, how it's pronounced, I'm Belgian. My mother language is Dutch, Flemish, if you want to be precise and make the linguists explode their heads when they hear me say this. My second language is French. My third language is English. I used to be really fluent in German. I'm not as much anymore because I haven't really spoken it regularly, in over 30 years. And I've almost a year in learning Spanish right now. So language comes relatively easy to me. It's just that I was really bad at math and all the stuff. I was pretty good at languages. So I understand the question as James posed it. And I think it's a good point. Now, can you learn an art or a system if you don't speak the language of the country or region that it comes from? Yes, you can. You just need to have a really good teacher. If you want to go deeper than that, than just learn it, then I think it would be really important to learn the language, and not just the language of that country, but also learn the history and also learn a lot about daily life throughout history, which is a lot different from learning, what you would read on the Wikipedia entry for that country, which is historical facts talking about the wars and blah, blah, blah. Sure, that is important. You need to know that, but also need to know what is daily life like in Japan, Indonesia, China, whatever, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago, and so on, so that you have a better understanding of the context in which certain things happened. And I think that is very often missing and difficult to understand. Why? Well, certain words don't really have a translation in another language. Fingerspitzengefühl for my German friends. Try to translate that in English. A translation could be the feeling you get in the tips of your fingers, but that doesn't tell you anything. So, look it up. Look it up on Google Translate, if you will, and see what you can come up with. Fingerspitzengefühl. It's very different. It's a very different translation. It's a very difficult way, to translate it if you look at it as a word. But if you look at it as a concept, of something that we try to bring across, then you get to, we need to explain it and give several sentences to bring across the idea that is conveyed in that word. But the translation, again, I don't know how you would translate that in English and be accurate with it. And there's a bunch of words in pretty much every language like that. There are also many concepts in languages that don't translate well or are very difficult to convey correctly. When you look at the Japanese language and culture, that's one of them where it's very difficult to explain certain things, and that includes even for the Japanese that will find it difficult to translate it for you and be accurate. Same thing is true for the Chinese arts, in which I spent many decades training. In that certain concepts, just you don't know how to translate them, which means that the only way to understand them is if you look at the context of where does that come from, what was the culture like, how does that concept interact with many other concepts, many other things, and so on. That's one aspect. And the other thing is that we we like to kind of look at things that we see in whatever art we practice as isolated, in the sense that we interpret that with basically our filters that we have from in our case, Western societies. And then we look at, for instance, an Asian martial art and interpret that through that filter. But they don't have the same filter as we do. Their cultural experience, their daily life is radically different from ours. For our Western audience, I'm European, many Western countries in the US as well. China does not have a huge Christian influence. So the Christian faith has never been a huge influence in China throughout history. A gigantic part of Western countries, the societies you find there, is the influence of the Christian faith. Whether you like it or not, whether you believe it or not, doesn't matter. You will find, historically speaking, that it influenced so much of how societies function. Even today, and you don't even have to be religious or go to church, doesn't matter. You will find that your institutions, your cultural filter, and so on is very strongly influenced by it. Here in Europe, where I live, for instance, the Greek and Roman influence is still present to this day, even though it's thousands of years ago since Julius Caesar and his buddies slaughtered my forefathers by the millions. I'm not kidding. It happened. So here's the thing. When you look at martial arts techniques and they explain certain things, if you don't know about that context, that history, that culture, not just now, but throughout time, it's very difficult to make sense of certain things. The biggest threat that I see is people putting that culture on a pedestal and taking only the parts of it that they A, think they understand, and B, that look cool or that we don't have in our culture and that they think is awesome, and so on. And then they either don't learn about everything else that you can find in that culture, or the things that are maybe not as cool or are a little bit silly, and so on. Give you an example. So I practice Chinese martial arts, think they're really awesome, very much enjoy them. They work well for me, and so on. I know a fair bit about Chinese culture. I even studied very poorly sinology in college for a year. So very much interested in the culture and so on. Big fan. Right. So it's easy to get lost in all the things you like about a culture. Look up virgin boy eggs in China. Look it up. And I'll put a link in the show notes. Now, if you, as a Westerner, look at that and think that it makes perfect sense, then you understand Chinese culture and history really, really well. If you go like, I have no idea why they would do such a thing, and I'm not going to spoil the surprise for those of you who don't know, so look it up, virgin boy eggs, look at that, and you're going to say that if anybody does that in your Western country, in public, the way it's done over there, those people get either arrested or you're going to have an interesting parent-teacher meeting, and law enforcement will get involved, and there will be a bunch of lawsuits. Whereas in China, it's perfectly acceptable. So that is why I believe it's so important to learn as much as you can about wherever your style or system comes from, so you get a more nuanced view and you aren't blinded by your love or admiration or enjoyment of practicing that art, so that you see it for what it actually is. Human beings are human beings everywhere on earth. There are a bunch of differences. There are also a bunch of similarities, and you know what I think about those two. But the point is that just like there are really bad martial arts teachers and idiots on the mats here in the West, you find the same thing in the East or in the country of origin. Just because you come from the country of origin of an art doesn't mean that you are really good at it. You should be, but that's definitely not always the case. So again, I'm a huge fan of trying to learn as much as you can. And yes, James, if you can, you want to go deep, learn about a country that is starting with the language and then learning more, again, like I said, history, background, context, and in particular, the daily life history. That is what I think is where the key is. Right. Okay, next one. Mary Stevens. Mary asks, I like the idea of suggestions for the elderly. Adaptations for vulnerable minority groups is a real area of interest. I was asked yesterday if I would design and deliver self-protection workshops, a self-protection workshop for autistic teens. Niche but important. Any thoughts welcomed. I've also had trans students needing self-protection specifics to help with de-escalation situations. Difficult topic. So I just covered the elderly. I'm going to talk a little bit about minority groups. A lot of it is very, in my opinion, specific to the area that you live in. For instance, like I said, right now I am following the violence that is happening in South Africa. I've been posting about that on my Minds channel, and I'll put a link to in the show notes there. So my Minds channel is where I focus mainly on safety and security, not really anything about martial arts or so on, but mainly self-defense, safety, security, and so on. It's a little bit different than my other social media. The content on Minds is unique. I don't post it anywhere else. I posted about South Africa. One of the things there is the Indian minority. People from India have businesses there and so on. They have been targeted by the rioters and looters and the violence. So they are a minority there. Obviously, in India, those people are the majority. So what it looks like there when it comes to self-defense for minority groups is going to be very different from, for instance, the Indian population in Palo Alto, California, which is the heart of Silicon Valley, which has a significant Indian population as well. And when I mean Palo Alto, I mean just Palo Alto and the surrounding areas, all the way to, Los Gatos and the other ones where a lot of people in Silicon Valley live now. There's a fairly substantial population of Indian people living there, but they are still a minority. Well, life there is very different. So I think it's very difficult to have like a general training program when it comes to self-defense for a minority group, because their experiences are not the same across the board. It depends on so many different factors that I think it's very difficult to just say, well, do this and this and this, because it won't necessarily apply. The human condition applies to minority groups just like it applies to everybody else. That means that they are vulnerable to all the things that we are, and many of the same factors apply. So I would start with general basics, which is always, legal aspects, de-escalation, prevention, avoidance, and so on. The general physical techniques that you teach for people will probably be very, very much the same. And the main thing is then looking at right. So if you're working with a minority group in a certain city or in a certain area, then you do the research like, okay, what is the type of violence or the type of problems that they are most likely to face? If there is an issue there, it will surely be reported in the news, or you can find people who can inform you of that. And then I would look for, obviously, always starting with avoidance and de-escalation, because that gets you the most bang for your buck. How specifically you can do that for those people. And then at the same time, maybe drill down into specific cases that you can draw from the news or from people who have experience, and then do case studies like, right, this happened or that happened and so on. And then use that to extrapolate and develop tools that work in a variety of similar situations. Meaning you take that specific case and you ask, right, okay, so how could we apply the things you already learned about avoidance and de-escalation on this particular case? Would it have worked? What would be a good idea? What would be a bad idea? How would you go about doing that? And so on. And the same thing for the physical stuff, the aftermath, the legal consequences, first aid, and everything else that is related to self-defense. So that's where I would start. Now, for instance, give you you mentioned trans students needing self-protection. This is a hot button topic. I'm going to say it anyway because it has to do with self-defense and it's important. And if somebody gets offended, it's not my intent to offend. It's just this is reality as I think it is. I'd have to look it up. If I can find it, I'll put it in the show notes. But there was a study done, or multiple studies, I don't remember, because it's been like at least a year, maybe 2 years since I read that. That basically said that the highest likelihood trans people have of violence is in their personal relationships. That is a radically different problem than facing discrimination and bigotry that turns into violence. It's radically different. It's completely different. Now, again, if I can find the study, I will link it. I'm not sure if I can find it because Google is not always helpful there, and it's been too long since I read it. But that was the gist of it, of the study. Now, that's what I mean with when you look at minority groups, that it's not easy to have like a one-size-fits-all solution. And you have to really dig deep into what are the problems that are specific to that group. And you might have to face some very uncomfortable realities, of which I just gave you one. And again, I've said this to people and they got extremely angry. And I said, that doesn't mean, me mentioning that does not mean that I have anything against trans people. It also doesn't mean that they shouldn't be able to defend themselves. Quite on the contrary. Anybody who is at risk of violence, in my opinion, should be helped as much as possible to avoid violence, avoid those risks, and give them the tools to overcome them, to avoid them, to come out as much as possible unharmed from those situations. But that doesn't change reality. If we have information and studies that give us certain point to certain aspects, certain specific problems that are not really all that comfortable to face, well, then we have to use that information to the best of our abilities to help keep people safe. So my point is that's why I said it's a hot button topic. It's difficult to talk about in this day and age, because a lot of people don't want to even hear what I just said, and then I get labeled transphobic and so on. I'm like, okay, you can think that if you like. It doesn't change the facts. Now, if tomorrow a study comes out and proves that wrong, awesome. Then then this is how science works. This is how studies work. Is that you keep on doing these studies to figure out what the hell's going on. And things change, life changes. Could be that, in 5 years' time, the stat that I just mentioned is no longer valid and something else is a bigger issue. Awesome, let's focus on that. So, and the same is true for many other minorities. When you dig down into certain aspects of violence, it gets really uncomfortable and then it becomes political. And as you guys know, I am not into politics and I don't want to have anything to do with it on my podcast, on my social media, and so on, because it's a waste of my time. Right, that's it. Okay, hope that helps, Mary. Next one, Jason Griffiths. Jason asked, maybe something on self-defense, but before an incident happens, because if you can avoid or diffuse beforehand, there won't be an event. I think I've talked a fair amount of that already. So I'm not going to go all that deeply into it. What I will do is I have a few articles on my website, on my blog, basically, talking about de-escalation and a lot of stuff. I'm just making a quick note that I put it in the show notes. It has Peyton Quinn's rules, which I think are awesome. It's, for instance, before it starts, don't insult the guy, don't pretend it's not happening, give him a face-saving exit, and so on. So some really practical, no-nonsense rules that work well. There's another article that I wrote years ago that is 8 self-defense tips for men. It's one of my most visited pages on my blog, even now. So, because it seems to resonate with people. And that's all about nothing to do with actual fighting techniques, but more about, follow these guidelines and you will be able to avoid a lot of problems. For instance, get over yourself. Don't just like Chris Rock says, young man, if somebody smudges your Pumas, then that's your sneakers for the young folks. Let it slide. Don't get up in somebody's face because they step on your foot. Don't pick a fight with everything. Another rule is that everybody's the hero in his own story. The guy in front of you who is, in your view, acting like an asshole, he doesn't think he's the asshole. He thinks you are the asshole. So understand that, and you can avoid a lot of problems. Stick to the mission, which is my main rule. Is what is your mission? Well, mine is very easy. I've talked about it many times, that every time I go out of the door, I'll do whatever I can to come back home safe and sound to my loved ones and lead an awesome life with them. If you stick to the mission, that will avoid a lot of problems. If some idiot cuts me off in traffic, tailgating him and picking a fight at the next crossing and stepping out and getting into the fight with the guy, and becoming famous on YouTube and getting sued my ass off, that doesn't stick to the mission. So have a mission. Figure it out for yourself what it is. And again, go to the 8 Tips for Self-Defense article for some more of that stuff. But everything there has to do with self-defense before an incident can happen. Here's the thing. All those things, Peyton's rules, my 8 tips, everything else that you can read, you have to work at it. That is the critical part. Just like you train for all the physical techniques that you learn for self-defense, you have to actually work at this kind of stuff to get better at it. Every time you are upset, every time you are angry, every time there's an incident that can lead to violence, work at those specific things. That means you have to have a commitment to that. That means that you have to have a minimum of self-control over your emotions, over your actions, and so on. We all get upset, we all get angry, it happens, we all get frustrated, stressed out, and we all have days where things go bad, for so long that you can just snap. It all happens. Well, that's why you train to not snap in those times and then snap against the worst, the wrong person who will take you up on that offer of violence. All right, Jason, I hope that's a good one as far as answers go. Next one. Again, I said this is the maximum effort edition of the Q&A, so I'm going to keep going. I've got a few more. Rob Stalinsky, sorry Rob, I'm butchering your name. He says, in the US, each state has its own set of laws governing the notion of self-defense. The underlying idea of laws seem to be based on the protection of property as well as looking at both parties involved as being equal, aka not bad guy versus good guy. Having done martial arts and self-defense for a minute, the overall theme thought is from a bad guy versus good guy standpoint. Very little, if any, time is spent on de-escalation, avoidance, and dealing with the aftermath, let's say, of any such encounter, being both physical or preemptive. Now, I get that combative is fun, gets people in, having a good time, and a basic understanding of how one might handle themselves in a possible physical altercation, but does this training set up the student for failure when they are not prepared to deal with the legal aftermath from their trained actions? And also, does it set up the student to bypass or put effort into de-escalation? Should instructors be teaching self-defense from the local legal context of their location and not a one-size-fits-all approach? What responsibility rests on the instructor for their students' actions? Great question. There were a bunch of answers already in the comments on Rob's post in the Facebook group. To a large degree, I think it's true. When I started training, there was zero mention about de-escalation, legal aspects, and so on. And I don't know anybody who got that kind of stuff in martial arts class. I think, we've come a long way since then. I think in many martial arts classes and gyms that they start to incorporate these aspects in their teaching. I know I do. Maybe not as much as certain people do. Like if you have a traditional martial art, there's a lot more than just the legal aspects that you need to focus on. There's already quite a lot, and you only have like an hour or 2 hours time of training, or even less. So it becomes a matter of priorities and available time. On the other hand, what I do see is especially younger teachers, guys, my age and younger, who have come up in the old methods, but also started reading, learning, and so on, and finding out that there's a lot more than just punching and kicking somebody. So that all the preemptive stuff and de-escalation and so on is equally important. So I think that is changing. I agree. It's still a big part of the martial arts and self-defense community is not as much into that as they should be, perhaps. But I think it's getting better. Over time, I think this kind of information will more and more become available. That's at least the impression that I have. There's more and more of the emphasis on non-physical aspects of self-defense and training. Now, does that set the student up for failure when they're not prepared to deal with the legal aftermath? Yeah. And there are examples of that, many examples of people who applied their training and ended up facing the legal system and not coming out on top. So, and also, as you said, does that set up the student to bypass or put effort into the de-escalation? Yup. In many cases, if people aren't even aware of the fact that, legally speaking, you can't really do that. You can't give him 15 punches and break his neck just because he bumped into your shoulder. It's easy to bypass all the effort that you should put into not letting evolve things into a fight, because you are not in a legal self-defense situation when you do this kind of extreme stuff. Which begs the question, what is legal self-defense? Well, kind of like you said, I think there is a one-size-fits-all approach, because there are general rules when it comes to self-defense that tend to be, if not universal, very, very often there is some version of it in most countries, especially most Western countries, when it comes to self-defense. For instance, that you have to have some sort of proportionality. Meaning if I weigh 250 pounds and, a 70-pound child kicks me in the shins, I can't just, pick him up and beat him up and do all my fancy whatever techniques and leave him crippled or worse. That's not self-defense. There's no proportionality. Vice versa. If I attack that child is probably justified in using some sort of lethal force on me if it can get its hands on a weapon, because of the disparity of size. So that would be one of the factors that would go into a more general framework of the legal aspects. And then obviously you need to go local. Belgian law is not US law, and US law in general is very different when you go state by state. So I think it's critical that you explain local laws to your students, and if your teacher doesn't teach it, you go out and learn it by yourself. You're responsible for you. As to the final question, what responsibility rests on the instructor for their students' actions? That's a tricky one. I struggle with that after over 30 years of being an instructor. I think as an instructor, you have to be able to look yourself in the eyes as you stare in your mirror, and be able to say to yourself, "What you did the best you could, and you didn't shirk your responsibility." On the other hand, there are limits to it. You, as an instructor, you cannot control what the actions will be of your students. There's no way. They leave class and they are leading their own lives. And as the age-old question with teaching publicly, with making videos and books and so on, is that, aren't you afraid that the wrong people will learn your techniques and this and that? And my point is that the wrong people will find those techniques anyway. That's for starters. And B, the counterpoint to that is that the right people might need those techniques against the wrong people. So where do you draw the line? I think every instructor needs to figure that out by himself. It's not something I would be comfortable, imposing on anybody else, because who died and made me God, right? So I think that's a very personal question. I take my responsibilities seriously when it comes to my students. I don't talk about it all that much because it's personal, but I do the best I can. I try to train my students the best I can, and I try to very often give them homework and explain, right, okay, spend some time looking this up, or talk about this, or think about this, or did you see that on the news, and so on, to feed those seeds in their minds of things that they might actually use to then go a lot further into whatever aspect of self-defense that we just mentioned, but it's de-escalation, legal stuff, and so on, aftermath. So I think you as an instructor need to do the best you can and not just dismiss this out of hand, like, well, once they go out the door, that's no longer my problem. I don't think that's right. On the other hand, it's a little bit too easy to dismiss personal responsibility and put all the blame on the instructor if something goes wrong. I don't agree with that either. So my response would be for you, Rob, is that it's very personal. Everybody's different depending on the art that you teach. For instance, if you teach a martial sport, well, self-defense is not even on the radar for you because you're teaching a sport, you're not teaching self-defense. So that's where it starts for me, and then it gets complicated from there on out. All right, next one. We've got 3 more questions. First, the third one I'm going to start first. That's Peter Murphy. Peter asked how to approach training when you have limited time to train. For example, how to be more efficient with training, how to choose between fitness and technique. I work full-time and have a young family, so sometimes training has to take a backseat. How then can I be more efficient when I train? This is a question I get a lot, especially in my personal training practice. I've made thousands of training schedules for people, including people who have very little time. Many of my clients are CEOs of companies or businessmen or people who have extremely busy days, like 14, 15-hour days are very common for them. So this is a difficult topic. The first thing to do is make priorities. If you have limited time to train, you can't do everything. I also have limited time to train. I have more than most people, but I don't train as much as I'd like because I have to work. If it were me, I'd be training all day, but it's not an option for me. So limited is a very personal thing. So that first means determining how much time you do have. And that includes, calculating a buffer zone for when life happens, your kid gets sick, or the car breaks down and you have to go pick up the kids, or because your wife can't, and so on. All these things happen, so you have to have a buffer zone as well. But start with how much time is realistic. Not how much time would you want, but what do you actually have? And take a good look at that. Understand that you need regularity to achieve any results when it comes to fitness, conditioning, martial arts technique, whatever. So that means at least training twice a week at the very least. Preferably 3 times a week, and then not on following days. So on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Saturday would be awesome. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday would be terrible. It's better than nothing, but it's not very efficient. So that's the first thing. Next up, you will have to prioritize. If you only have 3 half hours a week, you won't be able to do a lot of fitness and a lot of martial arts training. It's just not going to happen because you don't have enough time. You can try to combine them to a certain degree, but it's just not going to be the same thing than if you have, let's say 5 training sessions. You have 3 times a week you go to the gym, and 2 times a week you go to martial arts class for an hour and a half. Yeah, that's going to be very, very different if you can focus more like that. So if you have limited time, you will not be able to do everything you might want to do, which means you have to pick which one is the most important. Whether it's fitness, whether it's martial arts, whether it's something else, pick one. Start with that. Now, one way of working that can be efficient is that, let's say that you do both martial arts and you want to do some sort of fitness. Let's call it weight training. Just to give you a simple example that's easy to understand. Start a cycle of 4 to 6 weeks of training in which you do maybe a little bit of weight training either before or preferably after you do your martial arts training. Just general stuff, general, preferably full body training and so on. And let's say that I'm just going to make it easy, but the numbers will change. You train for an hour. Start with 45 minutes of martial arts training and then do 15 minutes of strength training. Would it be ideal if you can separate those? Yes, but you don't have ideal. You have limited time. So start with that. Do that for 4 to 6 weeks. Then you can change it. Whatever you were working on martial arts wise in that period should have improved if you focused on it correctly. And then you're going to dial down a little bit the martial arts training and make it, let's say, 30-30, or you switch it around. You do 45 minutes of weight training first, and you might be tired, so then the next 15 minutes only you do your martial arts training, which is going to be difficult because your nervous system will be more tired and so on. And there's limits to this method. If you train hardcore power training, your martial arts technique after 45 minutes of powerlifting is not going to be all that great. So there's limits to this method, but that is a method that you can use to switch those around after a period of training where you focus on one thing and then you maintain what you focused on by just doing maintenance work and repeating it. But the other aspects that you want to get better at, that becomes your focus then. So when you do fitness, focus on that, and martial arts is like a supplement to the training. And after a while, you switch those around. All of a sudden, the martial arts becomes the main thing, and then the fitness becomes the supplement. This works in the long run, but again, it is nowhere near as efficient as having more training time. The biggest thing is accepting that, like you said, you have a young family, is that you won't have as much time as you like, and there will always be something else to do. Having, my kids are in the almost, 19 and almost 21. So I know how it feels to have a young family, but that means that you just have to live with the fact that you cannot train the way you used to before you got the kids. So do the best you can. And also understand that this will change. As the kids get older, they will be more able to, be on their own, not need full-time supervision, and then carve out some time for yourself and train. My kids watched me train so many times. I spent a lot of time just in the living room doing push-ups, lifting weights, and so on, while they were, playing there and saw me. I did a bunch of times, push-ups, and my daughter would sit on my back, so I didn't have to do, lift heavy weights. But she was 5'6" or maybe more, whatever, and then her weight on my back was the added intensity for my push-up training. So be creative as well. Right. Next question, Brian Hassler. You may have covered this already, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on the intersection between MMA and traditional martial arts, both in general and your personal experience of it. That's a great question, Brian. I've said this before, years ago actually, and I said that MMA is becoming a traditional martial art in and of itself, because you see more and more people switch from traditional martial arts teaching to switching MMA. There's actually an American martial arts chain of gyms that changed from, I think it was karate to MMA, and they are actually bringing out guys into the UFC from that program. So that's already happening. What I mainly mean with that, MMA becomes traditional in that it will copy a lot of things you already see in traditional martial arts, meaning a specific curriculum, belt tests, even when there didn't used to be, or some sort of degrees that you get from degree 1, degree 2, up to degree whatever, and then you become an assistant instructor, then you become an instructor, then you become let's call it a box holder, or you can become gym owner. You can do your own gym and be part of the whole community from your teacher, so you kind of become an affiliate gym, blah blah blah. So very typical of what you already see in traditional martial arts. Other aspects get involved. So instead of just sticking to MMA, it becomes MMA with self-defense as something that is also taught. Similar to what I do in my Boxing for Self-Defense books, is that I talk about boxing. How do you apply it towards self-defense when you start boxing? And the only thing you learn is sports boxing. Same thing for MMA. What if you learned MMA as a sport, but you want to learn how to use those techniques for self-defense? Well, you're going to have to basically reverse engineer certain things. And that always reminds me of my late teacher, Bob Orlando, who said, the wheel of self-defense and the wheel of martial arts kind of comes full circle. You start with people fighting. They discover fighting techniques, just like random techniques that seem to work. If you fight enough, that kind of evolves into a fighting system where it becomes more systematized, and you figure out how things work together and so on. Over time, that becomes a martial art where other things get involved, like, health, meditation, sometimes religion. It becomes very structured, and a lot of stuff is added that doesn't really need to be there purely for defending yourself. And that then devolves into a combat sport or a martial sport in which there are many, many rules and regulations, and a lot of things are forbidden. And then if you come up in that part of the equation, and then the first time you fight outside of the combat sport arena, and you figure out that, this doesn't really work in the same way, and you get your ass beat, and you have to start from scratch, figure out, okay, what are the fighting techniques that work? And so the circle is completed, and it starts again. This is what, in my opinion, is happening now with MMA, is that they discover what actually works in the octagon doesn't necessarily work in the street as well. I'll give you a good example of that. I think it was Guy Metzger, and if I can find it, I will actually put the link in the show notes. I'm gonna make a quick note about that. But basically, I think it was Guy Metzger, and Guy was, UFC champion, so he can fight. And he ended up intervening in an altercation in the street between a guy and a girl, a couple that were fighting and so on. And he punched the guy. Guy comes back, swings at him, and Guy, I think he pushed him, punched him, and knocked him out. Whatever he did, I don't remember. But he blocked an incoming punch from his attacker. And then afterwards, he saw that the guy had a knife and just cut up his hand completely. And he's very lucky that he still has the use of his hand, because I remember seeing the wound. And that was a pretty deep cut. He could have been basically, crippled for life if that cut was a little bit deeper. Or if he hadn't blocked it, he could have ended up dead if that would have cut him, for instance, in the arteries and so on, hit him in the neck or disfigured him, what have you. Imagine the consequences. Here's the thing: Guy Metzger can fight. Nobody will say that he can't fight. Plenty of fights that you can see recorded in the UFC that he was a badass, right? But that doesn't always translate completely to the realities of self-defense outside of the octagon, of which I've talked many times in articles as well. And I'll put a link to the show, to an article from the octagon to the street that I have on my blog, which covers that in a little bit already. The point is that a lot of MMA teachers and gyms now offer self-defense courses, and they have to reverse engineer a lot of the things that they eventually then see that are in traditional martial arts, if those traditional martial arts have kept the reasons for certain things alive, which is not a given at all. A lot of traditional martial arts have lost their way when it comes to self-defense. Again, remember what I just said about the cycle of evolution and devolution that Bob Orlando mentioned. So a good example is Tim Kennedy, I think he's a Ranger or Special Forces. I forget what outfit he's with, but you can see a lot of the stuff that he does is basically like a lot of BJJ, but with the environment in mind, with self-defense in mind, with weapons in mind, and so on. So you don't do the exact same grappling like you would do in the octagon or on the mat, on the BJJ tournament or scene. Because if the guy is armed, it changes things. And Tim is doing a lot of interesting stuff in that regard. So I would definitely, check out his stuff and see what he has to offer, and also the reasons why. Like, okay, we'll do this, but we won't do this, even though it works really well in the octagon or on the mats because of this and this and this reason. That's what I mean with reverse engineering. You have to basically take MMA as it is practiced and kind of alter and tweak it for those additional realities of weapons, multiple opponents, blah, 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 all the other things. So that's one aspect of the answer. The other aspect is you see more and more people in MMA basically take techniques from traditional martial arts. And which is funny because I was there with the first UFCs. And I remember how, a lot of the people who were either fighting in the UFC or UFC fans were like, see all that traditional martial arts is bullshit. They can't hack it in the UFC, which was true at the time for many guys entering. But the point is that what I see them do now is try to look more and more towards traditional martial arts for inspiration, for techniques, for concepts, and so on. Good example is the oblique kick. Just me personally, when I competed in Sanda, we were practicing oblique kicks like 30 years ago. That was before people saw John Jones use them. Nobody was doing them in MMA. Nobody. The crane kick that you saw Lyoto Machida do. First Belgian championship that I won, I used it against a guy, and how old was I? 21? 22? I don't remember. 20? Long time ago. I did a crane kick and kicked the guy in the eye and DKO'd him. And we practiced that a lot. And all of a sudden, and everybody said, doesn't work in the octagon. And then you see Lyoto Machida do it. And then all of a sudden people think it works. So a lot of that kind of stuff. Same thing, braced elbows, which is basically you hold the guy's head and then you elbow him. That is something that you didn't see a lot because everybody was focused on the Muay Thai plum. And I'm not talking about the way you hold the head in Muay Thai when you elbow somebody. I'm talking about something else. Elbow position is different. But then we saw basically not shearing elbows, the way that Bob Orlando described them. So shearing elbows is two lines of striking that don't intersect. So you slap the guy's head towards your elbow, but at a different height. Hard to explain in words, easy to show. What I've seen in MMA now is people using the crushing type impacts, which is basically they hit the guy into their elbow. So imagine a horizontal elbow to somebody's face, and at the same time you hit the guy in the back of the head with your open hand to accelerate him into your incoming elbow. So you're kind of smashing, like imagine that you're clapping your hands and somebody's head is in between. Instead of doing it with both hands, you do it with one hand and one elbow. That is something that comes from traditional martial arts and that I've seen guys do in MMA. And there's more and more. One of the things I've said then, for anybody who's into MMA, go to MMAformula.com. Again, I'll put a link in the show notes. That is my MMA website, podcast, and so on. So I talk more about that. But one of the things that I've mentioned is that the half kneeling positions and the seated positions, which is something that you do not see in MMA except by accident. And every now and then you see somebody doing it more methodically. For the longest time, what we had in MMA was when in the UFC or in Octagon or any MMA tournament or fighting organization, somebody goes to the ground and the other guy dives on top of him and ends up in his guard and do ground and pound. There are many different ways of approaching that situation. If you down your opponent, you don't have to dive on top of him. This is slowly getting better. You also don't just have to grab his legs and try to pass, swing them to the side and dive on top of him, or just leg kick his legs as he picks them up to defend himself. Those are not the only two options. And that's where we get to half kneeling, kneeling, and seated positions. Michael Chandler knocking out Dan Hooker is an example of that. Looked at a certain point, he's basically in a kneeling position as he's striking. Here's the thing, that to me, what I see is it's all incidental. It just happens that he's there and he just strikes. The next phase is that they will do this on purpose. How do you transition from standing to kneeling, to half kneeling to kneeling to seated, and vice versa, and fight from there? Which is with not the idea of simply going into grappling. But you can actually strike there. You can actually clinch there. You can grapple there. And those are things that come directly from traditional martial arts. So that's the kind of stuff that I think we'll see more of. Obviously, the MMA community being what it is, they're not going to say that, well, I know I took that from this old Chinese style. They're not going to say that. They're going to say that they invented it or whatever, which is fine. That's fine. But this is the stuff that I see happening, and I think will happen more and more. Right. I hope that's a good answer, Brian. One more question. This is the last one. Again, this is the maximum effort edition of the podcast. So Pat Johnson asks, I don't know if I'm phrasing this in a way that is easy to understand, but could you talk about the difference in viewing training martial arts with an ending or as a lifelong journey? For example, I want to get my black belt in BJJ, or I want to become all Japan judo champion before I retire, versus I'm going to be doing this in some way, shape, or form forever. Yeah. I think in many ways, this is something that is an automatic journey for a lot of people. And the difference between a martial artist and an athlete. Let me explain it this way. So you see a lot of guys that do some sort of combat sport, and then when they're done, they stop training. That when they can't compete anymore, they get too old for competition, they stop training. That is an athlete. It's like a lot of people who do some sort of I'll take a local example. Eddy Merckx, cycling champion from Belgium. I used to live really close to where he lived, actually. I saw him a few times just standing there. For the longest time, he was very much overweight. Sorry, Eddie. It's true. And he was then, for some sort of TV show, I think they went to Mexico again, I don't remember, and they put him back on a bike, and he was riding with the presenter, and they were talking, and he said, I haven't been on a bike in years. That's what I mean. Now, apparently he lost the weight and he trained again, and now I don't know what he does, but I'm taking an example, and all you cycling fans, don't get your panties in a wad. This is just me giving an example of something that I saw Mr. Merckx say himself. So I saw it, you didn't, so I'm right and you're wrong there. But in all seriousness, I've seen this many, many times. People who's just, competition stops, the sport's over, they go on to do something else. And that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. There's a huge difference in mindset with people who are basically martial artists, in that even if they start by competition, or they don't start by competition but they end up there, that it's just something that speaks to them and they just want to keep doing it, and as long as they can. And that is very different. I think he's still too young to be sure, but I think Georges St-Pierre is one of those examples. And he said so publicly as well. He said, I'm a martial artist first, but I'm also an MMA fighter. And you can see that when he first retired, he was still training. He was still working out. He was still in the gym. He did a bunch of other stuff. He did gymnastics, but he also did, he went to Thailand to train. He traveled to train during his career, but also after. So he didn't stop being a martial artist. He kept going. His focus changed, obviously. If you don't have to be in competition shape, you can focus on different things. But he just kept training. And I think in many ways that is what defines being a martial artist. is that it's something that you become eventually, and it becomes a part of your life. I cannot imagine not training. I've been training since I was a teenager, and I can't imagine not training. I don't train like I used to because I'm older now and it just doesn't work. But I can't imagine saying, well, I'll never train again. I would have to be even more broken down and injured than I am now. So the point is that this is a mindset thing, and I think I don't like to use the word calling. It's not a calling in the sense that, going into the priesthood is supposed to be a calling, which I don't know anything about because I'm not that religious, but that's the explanation you often hear. But I think it kind of is something similar in that martial arts needs to speak to you. There needs to be something there that resonates with you, and it becomes a lifelong journey. Another aspect is that it depends in large part in what style you're learning and who you're learning it with. Some teachers can only bring you so far because of the way they teach, because of their understanding of the style, and so on. That might mean that you stop with that style at a certain point and go do something else. If you don't find that something else, then perhaps you quit. If you do find something else, maybe that style and that teacher has the depth that you were looking for and didn't find in the original style. Or it might be that it's the same experience, and then, after a few years you stop with that as well because you feel like this isn't really for me, or I'm not getting anywhere, and you move on. Then that becomes the next, basically, choke point where either you can manage to go through and find yet another style, or you give up and do, cycling and fitness and go jogging, whatever. So that experience, that journey can be stopped along the way for multiple reasons. But the main part will be is who comes onto your path as a teacher. I've been extremely fortunate that I've had many teachers, and my main teachers were always people who were able to offer me a lot of in-depth training and so on. But I've also practiced some styles where I figured out that this isn't for me. But I knew up front that I wasn't going to give up whatever style, the martial arts in general, sorry. I just knew that this here isn't for me, but something else is out there, and I've already found some of the stuff that is out there for me, and then I'll keep going. And I think in that regard, if you find at least one style that you know that, okay, there's so much depth here that I can keep training for decades on end and still not get to the end of it, then I think that's a good start. That's going to help you like becoming something that becomes a permanent part of your life. That said, one of the pitfalls, and I mentioned this before, that Danny Dos Santos said this, and he said that they asked him, why do you still train so hard, when he was already, I think, in his 70s. He said, if I stop, I'll probably not pick it up again. So I'm afraid to stop. I don't want to stop. I want to keep going. If for whatever reason, injuries and so on, you cannot train for a relatively long time the way you normally can, there will be other reasons in your life to quit training. And it's very, very difficult to overcome those. Speaking for myself, as you guys know, I've had a fair amount of injuries, surgeries, and other problems, physically speaking, that make it difficult to train. There were periods in my life that I definitely wasn't sure if I could keep going. And that's one of the reasons why I kept on teaching, so that it forced me to get through those moments in my life when there were more reasons to quit than to continue. I knew that if I stopped teaching, there was a chance that I would stop completely. So I put myself in a position that I had to keep going. And that is also something that you do as a choice. Is it worth it for me? Do I really want to keep going? And do I know that there will be moments where the temptation to give up will be very strong? There will be many reasons. Am I willing to set something up beforehand that is going to help me through that? Or am I of the opinion that, well, if that happens, then that's what it is? That's something you have to decide. What I can tell you is that I've had so many times the experience that somebody trains with me for a while, for whatever reason they stop, and then years later they come back, or I run into them somewhere, we talk, and they say, I should never have left. I should have kept on training. And I'm like, yeah, that's up to you, man. I mean, what can I say? If you would have kept training, you would have been really good by now. Sure. I'm sorry you feel that way, but I never stopped you from training. So we all leave. I never blame anybody, or I never get upset about that. I just think it's. I'm sorry for you that you kind of feel that you lost all this time, and then sometimes they're in a position that they can't take up training again because they have responsibilities and or they moved on or went to live somewhere else, whatever, and then it doesn't work anymore. That's just the way life goes. So for you, Pan, I don't know if I can offer any real advice because it's so personal. I know that the martial arts and self-defense path is for me. After, I think it's about 35 years now of training, there's still so much for me to learn. There's still so much that I see that I want to dig deeper into. And every time I think, well, now I've pretty much hit the bottom of the barrel, I discover that there's a new barrel underneath and a whole new area of study is there. I've had that so many times that I just, have the point of view that I'll never be able to learn it all, no matter how hard I try, but that doesn't mean that the journey won't be awesome. And it has been awesome for me. And that is kind of the overall message that I would leave you with, is that if you enjoy it, if it brings you joy, if it keeps you healthy, if it's good for you. In my case, it allowed me to travel the world, meet awesome people, meet some of my best friends that I have in the world right now. It's just given me so much. So I kind of have this notion of, in the last 35 years of training and basically becoming a professional martial artist, about 27 years ago, I've had so many blessings come my way thanks to that. I just want to see what next is in store if I keep going down this path. If I keep going on this journey, how many more awesome things will I be able to experience? How many more awesome people will I be able to meet and, for instance, talk to in my interviews for my podcast, for instance? Just that has been awesome, getting to pick the brains of people that I respect, or people who have like specialties and expertise that I don't have. I mean, awesome, right? So that's one of the reasons why I keep going, and that might apply to you too. All right, guys. That is pretty much it for this special edition. We're going for about an hour and a half now. So did I say it was the maximum effort edition or what? Right? So I think I held up to my end of the deal. I want to thank everybody for giving me the questions. And if you want to send me some questions for the next installment of the Q&A, because I've done a few of those already on the podcast, and definitely we'll do some more. The easiest way is hit me up on the comment section of my blog where I post this episode, or you can go to the group, the Facebook group. I am not Aries. Again, links in the show notes, and check it out there. And just say, hey, Wim, for the next Q&A, would you mind answering this question? What often happens is that, for instance, I might already have answered that question in a previous episode or in a blog post or in a YouTube video. So, and then you get your answer right away. If not, then I will put it on the list and consider it. And if I think I can say something informational about it, I will. All right, everybody, thank you for staying with me for this last hour and a half. Hope you enjoyed it. All this stuff is top of my head stuff. Didn't really think it all much through, or through all that much. Sorry. It was just looking at the questions and then answering them as honestly as I could. And I hope everybody who listens to their answers, I hope they help you out, and I hope you can use them. If not, discard them. That is perfectly fine. Wouldn't be the first time that I'm wrong, so I won't feel bad about it if you think, Wim, you're full of it. That was the worst answer ever. But if you enjoyed it, please consider giving this video a like, share it with your friends, share it with a bunch of people, and hopefully we can do this again next time. Okay, everybody, take care and stay safe.
Thanks for listening to the Demeere podcast. For more information, go to www.wimsblog.com.